this South Korean TV show has been a sensation for Netflix. It has quickly become the streaming service's most watched show ever. And it's ignited a global conversation about Netflix content, but also, as Mark was alluding to a conversation about South Korean culture and economics, hyperviolence in the media, and also somewhat incongruously, childhood as well. So in this show, for those of you who haven't seen it, heavily indebted Koreans enter into a deadly survivor takes all competition to win 45.6 billion won, which is the equivalent of roughly 50 million Australian dollars. Early in the show, we meet the protagonist, Seung Ji-hun, at a very low point. He's a divorced chauffeur and also a gambling addict. He lives with his very unwell elderly mother in a cramped, squalid apartment, and Ji-hun can't afford to pay for his mother's desperately needed medical costs, nor financially support his daughter, who lives with his former partner and her wealthy husband in a very lavish home, which contrasts sharply with Ji-hun's own living situation. And so Ji-hun meets a mysterious man at a train station who invites him to play a game that could win him a substantial cash prize. And he agrees to participate in the game out of complete desperation, even though he knows nothing about it. And when he accepts, he's sedated and transported to this mysterious facility that seems to be kind of part concentration camp and part theme park. So each stage of the competition in the show is in the form of classic Korean children's games, except as Mark suggested, they all have this deadly twist. The losers are killed at the end of each game, and their corpses kind of litter these highly stylized versions of children's play spaces that throughout the show kind of morbidly construct nostalgia for the adult participants' long-lost childhoods. So in the opening sequence of the show, all of this is kind of foreshadowed for us in a depiction of the eponymous Squid game, which is actually a popular, very traditional children's game in South Korea. So in this game, two teams compete for victory by shoving all the other members of the opposing team off the playing field. So this is the opening scene from the show. So there we have it, the opening to this now very famous show. And the opening offers us this kind of insight into the show's overarching, disturbing kind of premise, which really, as I suggested, problematizes and complicates nostalgia for childhood, freedom, and innocence. So this scene is, as you can see, kind of shot like a battle scene in a war film. We've got that kind of sepia, black and white hue. There's this language about kind of the attackers and owning the world, and that very percussive, kind of aggressive music throughout, and which also has that kind of playful, childish tone thanks to the flute melody. But the suggestion there via those kind of aesthetics is that starting in the playground, South Korean children are kind of inculcated into this social climate of fierce competition in which success and achievement can only be gained by eliminating the competition. So shoving others out of the way so that they are no longer even on the playing field. And Squid Game kind of gives the show its title in part because this particular childhood game is not just about winners and losers, it's about eliminating the losers, to take control of the entire playing field, to own the world, as the narrator tells us in that opening scene. So Squid Game is kind of narratively structured around this kind of provocation, I suppose, that competition is baked into the culture and lives of South Koreans from the playground kind of onwards, and that this ethos and emphasis on competition takes on these deadly and violent dimensions in adulthood when it becomes intertwined with these kind of free market neoliberal economic social structures. And obviously neoliberal capitalism has become quite a buzzword of the 21st century to describe political and ideological approaches focused on free market economic competition and so-called kind of small government. This idea that kind of minimal government involvement in public life is favourable to kind of interfering, using scare quotes all the time, interfering with kind of social structures, so leaving the composition of society to the free market. That's kind of at the heart of this neoliberal ideology. And we're all very aware, I'm sure, that tensions between this kind of neoliberal approach and less market-driven principles underpinning these current heated debates we're seeing in Australia between politicians and parties as we approach the next federal election. But I wanted to briefly go back to some key philosophical roots of this term neoliberalism, because it has actually been around for a very long time. And the influential French philosopher and cultural theorist Michel Foucault provided some kind of quite influential definitions. He argues that neoliberalism can be summed up as a shift from exchange to competition in the principle of the free market. And more recently, an author called William Davies has written a whole book about the ideologies and philosophies around neoliberalism. He suggests that neoliberalism is underpinned by the idea that economics operate as kind of society's guiding structuring force, with the capacity to quantify, distinguish, measure, and rank so as to construct and help navigate a world of constant overlapping competitions. So economics kind of seen as the supreme authority when it comes to how society should be organized is what Davies is getting at there. And he continues by saying, there are obviously issues with this kind of ideology. To argue in favour of competition and competitiveness is necessarily to argue in favour of inequality, he suggests, given that competitive activity is defined partly by the fact that it pursues an unequal outcome. Processes and rules which facilitate or aim to facilitate competition can themselves be understood as offering a normative sanction for inequality in some way. A society that celebrates and encourages competitiveness as an ethos, be it in sport, business, politics, or education, cannot then be surprised if outcomes are then highly unequal. So when it comes to Squid Game, the show's kind of observation in the opening scene that competition is central to children's play is rendered kind of horrifying when we see these children's games restaged for the adult characters in the form of this deadly competition, which leaves the colourful kind of children's play spaces littered with blood and corpses. So the ethos of competition at the centre of Squid Game, we see at the beginning of the show is kind of pushed to its extreme limits in this winner-takes-all competition, as losing the game obviously equates to loss of life. And reinforcing the kind of economic dimensions of this deadly competition, each time a participant of the game dies, 100 million won is added to the kitty that the winner will take home. And this is kind of a narrative conceit that emphasizes how the ethos of neoliberal competition kind of pits individuals against each other in the quest for financial gain. And we also learn later in the show that the corpses of dead participants are harvested for organs to be sold on the black market, kind of maximizing the economic value that can be extracted from their bodies. And this again kind of takes to the most grisly and extreme conclusions the neoliberal idea that an individual's value is defined in terms of kind of economic worth, this ability to produce capital. And in the show, kind of further reinforcing the subordination of human identity to kind of participation within a highly competitive neoliberal economic system. Within this Squid Game facility, all the competitors' names are discarded as soon as they enter the game in favour of these kind of player numbers. So coming back to Davies' point that a socio-political commitment to neoliberal competitiveness as an ethos results in highly unequal kind of social outcomes, more broadly, Squid Game presents this vision of kind of extreme social inequality. And as I'll talk about a bit later, this is a common thread throughout a lot of contemporary South Korean film and television. So we see this in the show on a micro level before Ji-hoon even enters the game, with this really dramatic distinction between his own situation and the situation and lifestyle of his former partner. But on a macro level, we kind of learn, and sorry, there will be spoilers for Squid Game in my presentation if you haven't seen it yet, but we learn later in the show that the cruel, bloody games that the characters are playing are staged to entertain this group of mysterious, ultra wealthy individuals whose identity is hidden by these kind of Venetian style masks. So these grotesquely overprivileged individuals speak in these really odd, over-exaggerated American accents. I'll just give you a taste for that now. So they're these kind of obscene parodies of ultra wealthy Americans, which seems to be a metaphorical gesture to the global dimensions of extreme economic inequality, in which a small group of ultra wealthy American men have amassed a substantial proportion of the world's wealth. And Oxfam have released a report, the 2022 report, Inequality Kills, which highlights that the wealth of the 10 richest men in the world has doubled, while the incomes of 99% of humanity have become worse off in light of the pandemic. Pretty frightening statistic. And the report also highlights that since 1995, the top 1% have captured nearly 20 times more global wealth than the bottom 50% of humanity. And it's no accident, of course, that Oxfam's report is called Inequality Kills. It's quite a provocative title, because they're trying to highlight that the world's most financially disadvantaged people have been the ones dying en masse of COVID. So the poorest people in some countries are 4 times more likely to die from COVID than the richest. So this kind of extreme global picture of financial winners and losers is allegorically depicted in Squid Game, in this kind of narrative of deadly competition. And another interesting thing in that Oxfam report is that it points out that South Korea is actually one of the few countries around the globe that has committed to reducing inequality as a national priority. And this is because this has become something of an emergency in South Korea. It's very low down the global list when it comes to wealth inequality. It ranked 168 out of 180 countries ranked in 2019. And it was ranked within the top 15 countries with the widest gap between rich and poor in this research that was reported on in USA Today. And there are also very low levels of social mobility in South Korea, which partly explains why, as a report in Undercover Asia and research from the Institute of International Finance has illuminated, it partly explains why household debt levels are amongst the highest in the world in South Korea. And problems with gambling addiction are rife in the country, which is obviously something that Squid Game picks up on, which makes some sense when you consider that gambling offers people a chance at wealth and social mobility not offered to most people in South Korea within this kind of neoliberal free market economic system. So in South Korea, OECD data reveals that low income earners make up about 38% of the labour force. So obviously a big percentage of the workforce on very low incomes. So Ji-hoon's character in Squid Game is kind of an embodiment of the human cost of this extreme economic inequality, which is embedded in South Korean social structures. His desperation to attain wealth via these kind of risky pursuits like gambling or the mysterious Squid Game, it makes total sense when understood in relation to this kind of constrictive and quite unequal social environment. And that Ji-hoon sees gambling and playing the mysterious game as his only opportunities to improve his financial situation also quite sharply interrogates this myth of individual responsibility and achievement that's at the heart of neoliberal kind of ideology. We're all familiar with this idea that if we just work hard enough and strive with all our might towards our own goals and achievements, we too can be like Bill Gates or Elon Musk, or at least some more modest variation of financial wealth and success. And this myth is that personal achievement can kind of overcome the social inequalities of the system, at least for us personally. But Squid Game kind of violently dramatizes the realization that this game is kind of rigged, that the rules aren't set to facilitate healthy and fair competitions, but to appease and entertain the kind of wealthy elite who are watching all the games and also bidding on the results of the games. And I'll just show you a quick sequence that kind of shows. also the kind of rules in Squid Game and in each of the games are often quite sadistic in the way that they're set up. So they encourage players to turn against each other. This is particularly acute in the marble game. So players are invited to team up. So they team up with friends and people they trust, only just to discover when they start playing that they're actually competitors. So only one of the two will walk out alive. I'll just show you a bit of that was one of the most painful scenes from the show for me. So again, this quite searing critique of how this neoliberal ethos of competition and the rules of the game kind of pit people against each other. And the show makes clear that the only way to win this game is to be the sole survivor and to thus kind of endure and survive the gruesome trauma that has cost the lives of your friends. And I alluded to earlier that Squid Game is actually just one of a number of recent examples in a wave of globally high-profile South Korean films and TV shows that offer really entertaining but these searing critiques of neoliberal capitalism and ideologies associated with that, and specifically social and economic inequality in South Korea as well as globally. So Bong Joon-ho's Oscar-winning or multi-Oscar award-winning Parasite depicts this situation via kind of novel aesthetic and narrative constructions of inequality of architecture. So in Parasite, the impoverished Kim family live in this tiny basement apartment in the South Korean capital, Seoul. They fold pizza boxes for a living, and the only way they can attain any level of social mobility is to pretend to be qualified workers for a wealthy family, the Parks. And this is a ruse that starts with the son, Ki-woo, posing as a university student who starts to work as an English tutor for the wealthy Park family's daughter. And each member of the Kim family eventually kind of join in on this scam, posing as these kind of unrelated trained professionals. The father poses as a chauffeur, for instance, to work for the Park family. And throughout the film, the beautiful kind of clean modern lines and these kind of immaculate, huge but warmly lit spaces of the lavish Park home are contrasted with the dank and crowded basement apartment of the Kim family. And this is kind of an architectural manifestation of inequality that's taken to extremes when the Kim family discover that the husband of the wealthy Park family's housekeeper has been living inside their home in this secret kind of underground bunker for many, many years. He's been kind of living off food that his wife was sneaking through a hole, and he's been living there because he was so poor and being hunted by loan sharks. And the contrasting kind of living spaces of the various characters in Parasite, from these kind of sweeping light-filled living rooms with kind of floor-to-ceiling windows to these grimy kind of subterranean basement, they obviously spatially kind of manifest the social inequality of South Korea and really highlight the contrast in day-to-day lifestyles and habits between low-income earners and wealthy Koreans. And Parasite's narrative suggests, again, that the only way to win this neoliberal game is to be born into wealth or to game the system. So to pose as someone higher on the social ladder, to literally kind of fake it until you make it. And again, children and young people are absolutely central to this story as well, in ways that kind of narrativize the different prospects and futures that lie ahead for kids that are born into privilege versus those that are born into poor families. So in his English language film Snowpiercer, Bong Joon-ho, which was from a few years earlier, Parasite came out in 2019, Snowpiercer came out in 2013. Bong Joon-ho depicts gross inequality spatially again, in very similar ways to Parasite. In this film, it's on a constantly moving train. So the film constructs this dystopian future in which, after global environmental disaster, all that's left of humanity lives on this train. And the poorest members are contained by armed guards at the very back of the train. They barely have enough food to survive. And the wealthiest people on the train live in these extravagant kind of roomy cabins at the front of the train, and live this very lavish kind of lifestyle. And again, children's culture is central to the shock of this film as well. A particularly memorable scene in Snowpiercer occurs when the poor people on the train who've staged this rebellion to kind of escape their misery at the back of the train, they discover that there is a school for the wealthy classes at the front of the train, and the teacher is kind of delivering propaganda to children about accepting life on the train and the social hierarchy that lives on the train. So children's culture is again positioned as this site of both fear and hope for a different future. And you can see that I get the sharp kind of aesthetic contrast Bong Joon-ho constructs between the dark, grimy life of the poor citizens and the bright, colourful existence of the children of the wealthy riders of the train. Even the South Korean pop song Gangnam Style, which has been delighting and annoying people since it became a smash hit about 10 years ago, it playfully kind of pokes at the inequalities of wealth. So Gangnam Style refers to the extravagant ways and lifestyles of the wealthy Gangnam district of South Korea's capital. And for those of you who don't think you remember this song, I've decided to save you from playing an audio clip so it doesn't get stuck in your head for the next 3 weeks. But I can assure you, if you go and Google it afterwards and listen to a few seconds, you definitely would have heard it. It was an absolute global smash hit. And the 2018 film Burning as well also picks up on a similar theme. It depicts the story of a country boy who lives on the border of South and North Korea. He actually lives so close to North Korea that he can hear the echoes of kind of propaganda announcements from the north. So he comes from a rural village, and he kind of gets wrapped up in the lives of this enchanting former classmate and her urbane kind of playboy friend, and they live this trendy, lavish Gangnam lifestyle, which is an existence and cultural language that this village-dwelling protagonist cannot really comprehend despite his best efforts to fit in. And this kind of failure to communicate across class distinctions has increasingly kind of chilling consequences in the film when the lead character's former classmate mysteriously goes missing. And I'll leave that description there because I think it would be a wonderful treat for all of you if you sought out this film. I believe it's on SBS On Demand, and it is an amazing film. So this kind of South Korean pop culture wave, which has become such a phenomenon, it's often described as the K-wave, or using the Chinese word Hallyu. It's actually turned in recent years to this kind of critical deconstruction of neoliberal capitalism and its effects. And these South Korean films, pop songs, TV shows have ignited this kind of global conversation about economic equality and the outcomes of social structures that are built around kind of neoliberal competition. And to come back to Squid Game, I think what's particularly compelling and interesting about this particular show is how this critique is tied to nostalgia and to children's culture. So as I kind of suggested at the beginning, the implication is that the roots of what's framed in the show as the kind of cultural sickness of economic and social inequality, they go very deep, starting with childhood games like Squid Game that inculcate children into the idea that the best way to win is to aggressively kind of push others out of the way, to eliminate the competition. So the show's depiction of neoliberal culture questions nostalgia for childhood on this collective but also personal level. And nostalgia, we all know, is this kind of act of looking back, of reflecting on our pasts with these rose-tinted glasses to kind of long to go back to this past, which obviously we know that's impossible, but nostalgia kind of feeds on this fantasy that we can somehow retain our childhoods. And nostalgia also involves the process of rewriting the past, so it fits the kind of emotional needs of our present. We can never be our childhood selves again. We can only kind of imagine them from the vantage of our current kind of adult identity. And for all those reasons, nostalgia is typically understood as a kind of comforting but pretty useless, unproductive phenomenon. a kind of clinging to our lost past that allows us to avoid confronting the problems of our present. But Squid Game's interesting because it shows us that nostalgia can also operate as a very conceptually challenging force in screen media like this, that kind of use nostalgia in these really critical ways. So nostalgia in Squid Game shows us how nostalgia can actually be used to reorient the way we conceptualize the past relationship to the present. So in Squid Game, as is probably clear already from the few clips and images I've shown you, that nostalgia for childhood is kind of co-opted by the engineers of these really sadistic games. And games like Red Light, Green Light, which has become probably the most memed moment from Squid Game. It's everywhere on social media, images from this particular scene in the show. Obviously twist frivolous childhood fun into something quite monstrous and sadistic. I'll show you a brief clip of Red Light, Green Light now, in case you're not familiar with this scene. We have a version of this exact same game in Australia we usually call it Statues, or at least we used to on the playground when I was a kid. So that's the first game the characters play in Squid Game when they realize that losing actually comes with deadly consequences. So as you can see, that the characters are forced to play these nostalgically constructed childhood games that impel them to remember things from their youth that might have been previously buried. And as the show progresses, their survival often depends on these childhood memories. And this conceit kind of illuminates this really painful disjuncture between the adult characters' present and their seemingly kind of carefree childhood past, when their futures lay ahead of them and still had promise. And the show also kind of resituates these characters' childhood memories to position them on this continuum in which these childhood games laid the groundwork for these kind of violent life and death competitions in adulthood. So nostalgia in Squid Game is very tense and uneasy in the way it's depicted. All that's kind of warm and fuzzy, or usually is warm and fuzzy about nostalgia, is kind of corroded, but it's used as a critical tool to, I suppose, impel us to think about the impact of children's culture on the way we relate to our position in society, and the value of working together versus competition. And to kind of finish on a related point, I wanted to close this presentation on a very intriguing and what some may find a troubling phenomenon, and that is that Squid Game has become very popular seemingly with child audiences. It's somehow struck a chord with young people, and there are, I mean, I'd be interested to hear what others think about this, why this might have happened. It's rated MA 15 plus. It's obviously, as you can see from the few clips I've shown, quite a hyper-violent, dark show. Netflix does have a track record of creating these original shows that are quite dark and that we wouldn't traditionally see as suitable for child audiences, but that do attract children. And that is, I guess, a distinction of streaming services like Netflix versus broadcast television, which does have to schedule content around ratings. So on broadcast TV, for instance, you have to put adult rated content in later time slots when younger kids are in bed. Netflix doesn't have to worry about this, and it's taken full advantage of that. And you can see from this is the tile from Netflix, the aesthetic holds clear appeal for kids. It's got this colorful kind of pastel playground equipment, which is featured in a lot of the promotional material. And also, as we've talked about, the show focuses on these kind of twisted versions of popular kids games, some of which are regional, like Squid Game, but still kind of familiar to kids all over the world. And some like Red Light, Green Light, which you just saw, which have kind of these variations all over the world. And Squid Game also makes these kids' games really important to the lives of the adult characters, as well as kids. So it kind of messes with the hierarchy in which we usually look at children's play as just kind of frivolous, meaningless kids stuff. And I'm sure that emphasis kind of holds some appeal for kids as well. So it's perhaps not that surprising that kids are interested in the themes and look of this show. But as I've kind of articulated in a conversational article I wrote, was going to say earlier this year, but it might have actually been last year. I can't actually remember now. It's actually possible that young children's awareness of the show relates not just to its popularity on Netflix, but also to its last year. I can see the date on it now. That's the conversation article I wrote, October last year. So the popularity of Squid Game with kids could relate a lot to the fact that it's kind of gone viral in many different ways on social media and across different sorts of digital media. So there's heaps of Squid Game content aimed at kids and young people on TikTok and on YouTube. And it's also very popular in a game called Roblox, which children can kind of, and kids can create, and teenagers can create these kind of user-generated levels for other gamers to play. And this is this kind of popularity with kids, which is evidenced by all this YouTube and TikTok and Roblox content, has led to a lot of concern in kind of some understandable ways. So schools, teachers, and to parents saying kind of be on the lookout for Squid Game content in your children's digital media kind of diet. And there are still no signs that this is having much of an effect. The proliferation of Squid Game themed kind of digital content for kids doesn't seem to be slowing down. And I mean, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, but many parents and teachers are clearly very concerned. But what I've found interesting about a lot of this Squid Game digital content that I've kind of waded through as part of my research is that it actually renders playful and very light-hearted, for the most part, the very tense and violently competitive themes of the show. So children's play in these kind of digital remixes of the games from this TV show, kind of reclaiming them and turning them again into this space of imagination and creativity rather than vicious competition. There are lots of YouTube videos around how to draw Squid Game characters, and all of these remixes of this red light, blue light, red light, green light game, a lot of them kind of turn it into something playful, funny, kind of a parody. So maybe the way children have co-opted Squid Game can give us hope that the cycles of kind of hyper-competitive neoliberal thinking and ways of relating to the world and each other can be broken down or broken through with the next generation.